All right. How's everybody doing? Good. Thumbs up. Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to get my notes up here. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about something's really interesting. At least I find it interesting, um, which is payment for ecosystem services. So I've made the title here, A Practical Way of Promoting Environmental and Economic Stewardship. So who's ever heard of PES before? Payment for Ecosystem Services. Yep. No. Yes. No. Good. Probably a mix. So, I mean, you're a bit more of an idea after this, but the thing is, it's a very broad area. So even the things that I'm going to show you are kind of vary a lot within certain kind of geographic areas and contexts, I guess you could say. So PES is the acronym for Payment for Ecosystem Services, right? And so while we know what ecosystem services are, but we might not. So most of you do, but some don't. So ecosystem services essentially are um, the goods and services that nature provides society, right? So if you want to look at on a day-to-day basis, when you wake up in the morning and you go and take a shower, guess what? Water comes out of the tap. And then you go to the fridge and you go to have some breakfast, and whatever you're eating, you maybe cereal with milk or eggs or whatever, yogurt. I mean, in any case, all of that is derived from nature. You have the water that is provided from aquifers and so forth. Is it similar to TEEB? Yes, TEEB is very closely related to PES. I mean, in fact, it's the same thing in a way. TEEB is just kind of a framework, an operational framework that focuses more on the pricing side of things, whereas PES predates TEEB, frankly. Um, so, I mean, this will make some sense in when you look at TEEB. Like TEEB kind of digs into the details a bit more. So ecosystem services are broken into four categories: provisioning, regulating, supporting, cultural, and aesthetic. So what's a provisioning ecosystem service? What would be a provisioning ecosystem service? Yes, food, stuff we eat. Water, same thing, stuff we drink or use. What would be a regulating ecosystem service? Wetlands could be lumber, not really. Nutrient cycling, nope, that's not. Stormwater management, yes. Yeah. So regulated ecosystem services tend to, they are ecosystem services that help with, I guess you could say, buffering nature to some degree or working with nature. So like for instance, coastal protection could be a regulating ecosystem service. Um, Another one is climate regulation, so carbon sequestration in wetlands too, but then also in forests. Okay, so it's kind of helps to regulate and keep things in balance, for lack of a better term. Maybe grasslands. Yeah, I could look at that. Supporting. What's a supporting ecosystem service? Someone said this already. One of them. There we go. Yes. Nutrients, nutrient cycling. What's another one? What's the big one? If you want to look at ecosystems. Yeah, perhaps. But the big kind of underlying fabric of nature that keeps everything together. Bio. No, no. Think of life on Earth. Close. There we go. Biodiversity. Biodiversity is one of the core supporting ecosystem services. And lastly, cultural and aesthetic. What are some cultural and aesthetic ecosystem services? Sure, be specific. What do we like to do in winter in Canada? Skiing, yes. Snowmobiling, sure. So all of that's, what's responsible, snowshoeing, backcountry skiing, whatever, and what do we like to do on lakes? We like to go canoeing, water skiing, fishing, yes, all that stuff. So all that is do we like to go, whatever, looking at animals and stuff like that. Cultural, First Nations religion, right? Even looking at a sunset, that's an aesthetic or cultural ecosystem service. All right, so kind of everything that nature kind of does for us is captured within those four main um, categories, and then within each one of those is a bunch of specific ones, right? Saskatchewan sunsets. Maybe I think Baja California sunsets are pretty darn good too, if you've ever seen one. So that's kind of the framework we got to work with. And it's funny, like I've talked to people about this before, and I did a project where I was interviewing people about what they thought about ecosystem services, and it was interesting because not just, I mean, I assume everybody knows about this stuff. It's not the case, and because when you think about it, it reframes how you look at nature when you really grasp that concept, and hopefully, I mean, I think it can change someone's behavior for the better. But when I said, well, what do you think about ecosystem services in the coastal zone of BC? And they're like, oh, well, I mean, are you talking about geotechnical work? Like they looked at it from like an environmental service provision, like us working on environmental stuff as, geotechnical, water quality technicians and stuff like that. So it was quite interesting. And that wasn't just like one or two people, that's a lot of people. But really, it's about what nature provides us. Okay. So at first, they're pretty controversial. So why do you think it'd be controversial at first when that whole idea came out in their, late 90s? What would like the purist say? Not even putting a price on something. Like we're not even there yet. Like before that. Yeah, even it wasn't an ownership issue. It's close though. It's more fundamental than that. A purist looks at nature as kind of a reductionist worldview. A different word I'm looking for starts with U. Nope. The opposite of that. There we go. Utilitarian. So the idea there was that, even proposing that we look at nature in this way caused like ecosophers and deep ecologists and folks like this, like Alan Drankson and those kind of folks, like John Muir would freak out if discuss this with him when he was alive, because it puts nature in a utilitarian framework. Says, okay, well, this is what nature provides for us, as opposed to looking at nature as this kind of like, wondrous kind of thing that we just are in awe of, which, we should be, but this breaks it down as like it's an anthropocentric and utilitarian way of looking at nature. And that's like, it's funny because in the 1990s, I mean, that was the debate all the time. I don't hear it as much these days, but then it was like, oh, are you a utilitarian, or are you a deep ecologist or something like this? So, that was kind of controversial when it was first being proposed. But the thing is, what this framework has allowed us to do is to be able to better create and understand compromise, particularly related to development decisions. And, purists don't like to compromise, and that's just, the way it is. And I think the thing that really pushed it in the direction of being accepted was the fact that we don't really have much of a choice if we are to actually come up with solutions to the degradation of the global biosphere. We kind of have to think about things in a somewhat utilitarian way because we utilize nature and natural resources. And therefore, this really kind of reinforced the need for a framework such as this. All right? But closely related to this is the idea of natural capital. Okay? So this idea of ecosystem services to some degree is predicated on the fact that the environment is comprised of natural capital. Okay, now I'm assuming, have you heard of natural capital before? Yes? I know 560 has because you've been reading about it. But yeah, I mean, natural capital is the idea, refers to the planet's basically bank, the stock of water, land, air, renewable and non-renewable resources, plants, animals, forests, minerals. So it's like the bank, the nature as bank, so a big stock. For anybody that's done modeling, you do stock and flow kind of diagrams to look at how natural systems work, like a lake or whatever. Same idea. You're looking at this bank of natural resources, some of which are non-renewable. We use them, they're done, and others that are renewable, right? So like forests to some degree are not some, they're a renewable resource. Okay, they grow back, or they, if we treat them right. Okay, so in this idea then, if you want to look at it kind of from a process standpoint, we have ecosystem services, which are things that are providing us, in some cases, they're providing us goods and services, actual materials that are drawn on the account of nature, this kind of like bank of nature that exists all across the planet in different regions. So you can visualize things that way. And it's a good way to explain stuff to people that are not familiar with this. So I'm just going to push you some useful links, and these, of course, will be featured in the notes that you can download from YouTube as well. But here's one definition that the David Suzuki Foundation gives for natural capital. And then there's a group here that some of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, you should become familiar with them, called the Natural Capital Coalition. And they're kind of like an organization, I guess, that is mandated with developing the practice or the understanding around natural capital, right? So they have methodologies for doing stuff, like how do you account for natural capital? So this is really important for 560, and this is stuff we'll be doing. And then, what are some convening bodies and so forth? Because obviously this changes with time as the research gets better. So there's all these kind of standards that are associated with that. Here's one other link, a couple others more standard oriented. This is from the European Community. And then here's one, a guideline for the apparel industry. So back to, I think David mentioned that, is this like TEEB? It's very, very, like it's linked at the hip to TEEB. TEEB is, again, is predicated on the fact that there's this bank of natural resources that's, is the natural capital account of the earth we draw on, some direct goods and services, and then others are like, services that are provided that they don't deplete necessarily, like some regulating services, but they can if we degrade or interfere with how they operate, right? Like, for instance, if you destroy wetlands in a region, and which is in a region that's subject to high energy storms, you may have fundamentally impacted the capability for the coastline to absorb storms. Therefore, coastal protection is the ecosystem service provided by wetlands, and that can be diminished if those wetlands are reduced, right? Question, does natural capital bank, etc., imply that nature is a storehouse, anthropocentric worldview? If not, how is it different? No, it's exactly that. And this is why some people would have a problem with it. And why some people have a problem with ecosystem service, because you could just say, ah, well, I mean, you're being anthropocentric. You're looking at nature as just like a supply of timber and a supply of water. And that's a legitimate argument, to be honest with you. Like, I get that and I understand that. And I don't think we should put everything on top of this. Like, I don't think everything is kind of predicated on ecosystem services and natural capital. I think they're useful, they're helpful, but it's not the be all and end all. Otherwise, we just become like, I don't know, I think it's a very shallow way to live and a shallow way to look at the world. Okay, especially when you look at some of the miraculous way things work in nature. Okay, so this standard here is from the apparel industry, right? So those in 560, this is useful because we're looking at we looked at for the first assignment, different ways of articulating sustainability accounting or management. And this is like a standard for doing that for the apparel industry. Okay. And TEEB is similar to that. It's like TEEB has their own standard for certain industries like agriculture or what have you. So the early work of this, though, and this came up in the BB Collaborate, you know, I mean, you could say that it goes back to, in fact, even to Baconian times, or you know, you could go back to looking at the way, you know, during the Industrial Revolution, right? That would be one way of looking at things. Whether we're looking at nature as something that's kind of there for our enjoyment or our wonder or utility. But the real work on this, operational work, started in the 90s, I'd say. Okay, so this is an article from Bob Costanza. This is the one that kind of is a seminal article for accounting for natural capital, or you know, the bank of natural capital. So this article is kind of famous, and it's about the global stock of environmental goods and services. Okay, that's one of the first articles where Bob Costanza and colleagues looked at and said, "Oh, well, what does nature, what does the environment globally give us?" Okay, and it's a good article. That's the one that's always cited. You need to cite that one. And then there's some other work, and Costanza and Herman Daly were two of the people that really kind of led the charge on this. So here's another Costanza article actually it's a book. It's not an article. On ecological economics. It's 1991, Science and Management of Sustainability, early work in that area. And then here's a good PDF about some of Herman Daly's work on ecological economics, early work. So if you check this out, this is a good one too. Again, these are all in the notes, so you don't have to write this down or copy it. Okay, so those two are like, if you want to start on this stuff, and I like to start with foundations usually when I'm looking at something new, and those are the ones to start with, Costanza and Herman Daly, as the kind of, in North America anyway, the modern, the modern founders, I guess, modern workers in that area. So what's the application? So we have a nature as a service provider and look to it as a bank of capital. And if that bank is eroded, then the services may diminish and we will lose long-term value, right? So this is where we need to think about if we like for example, a good example is the Colorado River, right? Is everybody familiar, or anybody familiar with the saga behind the Colorado River? You know, it's a perfect example of a degraded ecosystem service, water provision along the mighty Colorado, which now is no longer mighty because it's been so kind of basically abused. Trickle in the bottom of Mexico. I've driven over it, and it's like this dry. But you know, if there's not sustainable resource management and sustainable management of our affairs, various components of the environment or ecosystem services and natural capital will break down over time, right? So like climate and like other things as well. We can look at that, and a good way to phrase this, I think, and I like to use this terminology, it's highly anthropocentric, but it works when you're dealing with business people and people who are not in this field. The bank is being eroded. So if the bank is being eroded, then the services may well diminish, may also diminish. So this reframes natural resource management in kind of a different light. If you look at it as stock of natural capital and then the flows of ecosystem services and goods that come out of that we use, right? And it's a helpful way of framing things when you're trying to deal with different stakeholder groups that don't think about this stuff on a regular basis. So one of the challenge, though, is to apply the principles of economics to natural capital and ecosystem services such that economics can do its work, right? And economics is amazing at rationing resources, right? Finding the optimal value for resource exploitation. And if we do it properly, we can apply those principles and have good rationale for controlling or managing that flow and that degradation or draw on natural capital, and then the use of ecosystem goods and services. Okay, and that's really kind of one of the fundamental things behind what this is all about. So when thinking about that, we have to then ultimately get to what was brought up before, is pricing, putting a value on nature. So some of you have seen the TED Talk by Pavan Sukhdev, and that is TEEB is the means by which that pricing is executed, one way anyway. Okay, so a novel aspect of this whole thing is the fact that we're venturing to price things that have previously not been priced, right? Which is tricky in a lot of different ways, because nobody likes to pay for things, and once you get this new price come up, like a carbon tax or what have you, then the whole discussion changes, and you got to really examine how the pricing gets deployed and how people are kind of confronted with that pricing. So, for example, in British Columbia, when we go and turn on the tap and we let it run, we are benefiting from ecosystem service that nature provides us, right? Freshwater provision. Yet there's no fee for its use, right? You don't pay for fresh water in BC, and you can pretty much drink the water out of a lot of places in BC. You should have very little problem with drinking the water that's coming out of the tap, right? And there's no fee for that, so it's a free-for-all. And we're not the most water efficient people on the planet. I mean, because we don't have to pay for it. Whereas if you go to other areas where there's more scarcity and also pricing systems in place, like Mexico and so forth, then you sure as heck do have different behavior when it comes to water use, right? So payment for ecosystem service programs attempt to address this issue where unabated resource exploitation is reeled in. And that's where it kind of came into play. So I'm going to give you two examples that I'm going to talk through to some degree, and then we'll open up for questions. The first one I'm more familiar with because I've worked on it. So first one is carbon sequestration. So what type of ecosystem service is carbon sequestration? Sequestering of carbon, keeping carbon in the Earth system or in the biosphere. Yes, regulating. Perfect. It's a climate regulation exercise. Now, you could also say it's indirectly a provisioning ecosystem service, right? Because guess what? When we're growing corn and all that kind of stuff, carbon sequestration is occurring, and we then, use products that come out of that process from the photosynthesis and eat it. That's our food. So, I mean, you could say that, but really, typically, when we think about carbon sequestration in this, what I'm going to talk about, it's a regulating ecosystem service. It's a climate regulation ecosystem service. So we benefit from the awesome capacity of forests to help regulate climate. They play a significant role in carbon sequestration. Forests play a big role. But is it free? Is it free? Is it just this kind of free service that we have out there? So what is stopping someone, say if you were a landowner in an area with a lot of tropical lush forests, what is stopping you, if you own that land, to degrade those ecosystems and and ecosystem services and grow cattle, right? Um, Nothing, exactly. And that's been the problem. There has been no, aside from regulations, like maybe there's some land use regulations wherever you are or what have you, that could be something that might inhibit you. But usually in these places, I'm talking about like Nicaragua, Brazil, Ecuador, um, whatever, Colombia, Guyana, kind of I'll talk about. That's what you have. You have smallholder farmers or people that live on this land who are faced with that decision. We have these forests which are doing us a big favor, kind of collectively, but I mean, you need to make a living. So we need to look at this then from a PES standpoint. So, because the economics actually work in favor of cattle. Um, and in fact, if you look at kind of the major drivers of deforestation, tropical deforestation, cattle is a big, significant part of that process. So here's a good article on that in Amazonia. And this is actually where I got my start with this stuff, was in Amazonia and looking at drivers of ecosystem degradation and therefore degradation of ecosystem services. That was in mid to late 2000s. So this was all kind of like falling into place at that point in time. Okay, so what do we do? What's the solution then when you have landowners that own land that is doing some really awesome ecosystem service provision, but they need to make a buck and they need to sustain their livelihoods and their families and so forth. And there's ways that they can do that that are efficient, highly liquidatable, and known with not much risk. What do we do? There we go. We use PES. We use payment for ecosystem services. We need to create an economic disincentive for deforestation, not an incentive. Like the incentive is I can grow cattle and make money and then sustain myself. Whereas there is no economic incentive for leaving that forest alone, your land alone, and just letting it sit there, do its job from an ecosystem service standpoint if we're talking about regulating ecosystem services, right? And this is what I got into. I'm like, oh my gosh, and we're seeing a lot of degradation of these forests based on the fact that people need to make a living. So, what's the solution? Aside from just mandated conservation, because that was the previous solution, which is we're just make parks. But parks don't pay the bills. So REDD+ is one of the mechanisms that had been developed and is used today, which is essentially a payment for ecosystem service scheme. So REDD means reduced emissions from ecosystem degradation and deforestation. Plus is what was added to it shortly after because that accounts for kind of the social and economic dimensions of avoided deforestation, like whether or not there's livelihoods created. And that was a big deal because it was at the time that REDD was first launched, it was red. And then we realized that there had to be some kind of provision in place for livelihoods as well. So deforestation and forest degradation are responsible for roughly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And about 80% of the Earth's above ground carbon and 40% of the Earth's below ground carbon are in forests, right? So there's a lot of carbon in forests. And in addition to that, there's all this valuable stuff that goes along with forests, right? Like cultural value, right? The spiritual value of forests to many people, like myself included, and First Nations and many groups. The recreational value of forests for ecotourism and so forth, the aesthetic value, and of course, biodiversity. And biodiversity is fundamental to the health of global ecosystems. So we need to then find a way to then avoid deforestation and degradation. And so I'm going to send through some links here to give you some background stuff to chew on your own time, which give you a more detailed explanation of REDD programs and what REDD is all about. So this one, first one is from the Forest Carbon Partnership. This next one here is from UN REDD. And the third one is from the FAO. And the FAO is the Food and Agricultural Organization. So each of which has kind of a stake to play in land systems, but they have a different perspective on things somewhat. So how does it work? How do you price this stuff then? Okay, because the essence of this is we are going to then say, guess what? We're going to find a way of paying people who own land or have a stake in land such that they don't degrade it or deforest it. We'll give you an economic incentive to do that, as opposed to, I don't know, deforest, sell the timber, grow some cattle, and make some money. So how do you do that? How do you price that? Any ideas? How would you go about putting a price on that? First and foremost, what is the unit? What is the unit that you're going to price? Because it means like, you got to have a number of stuff, a number of X. What is it? Sure, but of what? A ton of what? Sure. It would be helpful if it was more than cutting the trees and raising cattle. Yes. But the unit of measure, though, is a ton of CO2 equivalents. CO2 equivalent, CO2e. You'll see that in the literature. Right? That's kind of the base. And why is CO2e? Because, I mean, there's CO2, but there's also methane and all this kind of other stuff, other greenhouse gases, and that's the baseline kind of comparing unit. So how would you measure that then? How do you think you'd go about saying, okay, well, how many tons of CO2 equivalents are in this area of land that I have, this few hectares? What would you do? Because it's a stock, you're measuring a stock that would otherwise be emitted if you cut all down those trees and burned it. It's super complicated. How would you measure it? How do you know how much carbon is in a forest? Do you want a hint? I'll give you some hints. Hint number one. You need a tape measure. What would you do with a tape measure? Close. Kind of. Getting close. Both of those relate to it. You're going to get at the number. There we go. Jeff for the win. You want to get at biomass, but you got to do this in a way that's fairly easy to measure, right? So it's not the height of the tree, because that's pretty, tricky to measure and it varies. But based on the species, you measured the diameter of the tree at chest height. Yes, DBH, diameter at breast height. And that's kind of a standard measurement for estimating the amount of carbon within a tree. And then, of course, you're not going to go around and measure every tree in a 20 hectare piece of land. So you would probably want to kind of take a sample, a transect, and you walk along it and, measure all the trees along that transect and then do some estimates based on, per this area, I measured this much, this many trees at this diameter at breast height of each tree. Then you look at the literature and say, well, based on the species, the diameter at breast height would roughly be this amount of CO2 equivalent of carbon stored in those trees. You can get even trickier then and get into like using satellite remote sensing, and I could do a whole lecture on that if you want, of estimating based on the surface reflectance of a forest and the species of what that would be in carbon equivalents, right? There's ways of doing that. The ideal, though, is to use some ground-based measures and then some geospatial measures to then extrapolate that over a larger area. So you say, okay, at this point here, I measured, did a transect and measured the amount of carbon. So I can say at this pixel reflectance, it was this measurement on the ground, and then you then parameterize across that space what the variation in that pixel value would be based on those measurements you made. That's kind of an easy way to explain something that can get quite complicated. Okay, but the key is you basically measure the amount of carbon that's stored in those trees, right? So the unit is the CO2 equivalent stored in a rainforest. Okay, so then you have a unit of measure. You can't price something if you don't have something to measure it by, because this will change, of course. If you have a highly dense forest, you have a lot of carbon stored in it. Therefore, presumably, it's going to be more valuable than just a sparsely forested area of land. Okay? So then, how would you then go establish the price for that unit? You want to put a price on that, because then you'd, like the comment before would say, Megan said it would be helpful if it was priced more than you can make from cutting down trees. And this has been the problem, and continues to be the problem, is you've got to find the right price signal for this stuff. Otherwise, the economics won't work. Okay? So the way to do that is there's a few different ways, but the ways that have been used are by looking at how much will people pay for a CO2 emission credit. Okay, so the way this would work, the way it does work in when you establish a RED project is when you establish a RED project, you're saying, look, this land here would previously was planned for development. You're avoiding degradation and deforestation. So this land here would most likely be deforested because the landowners or whomever would choose to kind of grow cattle and ag or whatever. But not do that. We're going to keep the forest standing. Therefore, we're going to avoid emissions and create an offset credit. You then go about measuring, the forest as to what the carbon stock is and potentially what kind of changes there might be. And you then have an avoided emission. So those avoided emissions are quantified as something called emissions reductions, right? Very similar to emissions reductions from, say, if you put like some sort of scrub ice or emissions reduction technology in place for a manufacturing plant that causes you to emit less, right? We reduce your CO2 emissions by X amount, and that's equivalent to a certain amount of credits, certified emissions reductions that you've achieved. Or if you do a renewable project as opposed to a coal burning power plant, you can get emissions credits. So in the land of RED, though, it hasn't quite got to the point of being regulated, whereas in other types of CO2 emissions, they are. So you have CERs, certified emissions reductions, which are when it's a certified emission reduction that can be traded on a market like the European ETS, the European Emissions Trading System. Whereas in the RED land, you still have VERs. Now, why? Because they're voluntary. No one is regulating you for doing this as of yet. That may come in the future, but as far as I understand, I don't know any country that has regulated this and said, like, you have to do this. So they're known as VERs, voluntary emissions reductions, and you quantify that, like I said, by monitoring and going on the ground and saying, okay, this avoided deforestation project is creating this much volume of avoided emissions in CO2 equivalents. But the pricing for these, that gets kind of tricky, because in a regulated environment, you would have a market that has then transactions going, like you have people are paying this amount of money for this, therefore it has this value, like tomatoes and like bananas and like whatever other commodities. Whereas in this side of things, the VERs, if you go to establish a RED project, it's highly contingent on what the buyers are willing to pay for those emissions reductions. Okay, so you can do a RED project and do all the measurements, because you have to follow certain protocols for measuring things and demonstrate that you've actually avoided emissions. You create all these VERs and can demonstrate that. Then you have to go kind of sell that to people, say, look at what we're doing. And in my experience, the prices have ranged from anywhere between $2 per ton through to $12 per ton, which isn't that much money when you look at kind of what most of the literature says, what we have to do, where the price per ton needs to be in order to achieve, say, climate targets and stuff like that. And there's a huge price swing on this as well. Like with that kind of price swing, you got to ask yourself, and what I asked myself first when I looked at this is, well, why is there such a big price swing? Like, what is the difference between this VER and that VER? One is selling for 10 and one is selling for $2. And from what I was told by the brokers, it was all based on optics. This looks like a great project, and it's kind of packaged nicely, and the buyers will like that, and they will pay more for that, as opposed to something that's a little more routine. So, which is kind of bizarre, really, when you think about it. But in reality, a lot of these projects, and this is a payment for ecosystem service project ultimately, are donor driven. So like a Big Red project, and the one I'm going to explain to you in Guyana, was completely funded by the Kingdom of Norway. So Guyana has a very significant reduced emissions from the ecosystem degradation and deforestation project that is paid for by Norway. Here's the link. The Guyana, and they call it the Guyana Red Fund, GRIF. And that is a $250 million US fund that's given by the Kingdom of Norway to Guyana to basically corner off a large proportion of the rainforests, monitor them, and create, monitored VERs. And in that case, it's not as much about a transaction as it is about a sustainable development investment on the part of Norway. Now, I don't know for sure, but I presume that any VERs that are coming out of that, any emission reduction credits, are the property of Norway, so they can say, look, we're carbon neutral. But I'm not sure about that. I can't speak about that for now. What I do know a lot about is the execution of the project on the ground. So they have received that money, that 250, well, less than that, for specific funding mechanisms that gives them the money that they can go and hire people to monitor and patrol and manage that forest, that area of forest, right? So in addition to that, the government of Guyana has developed something called the LCDS, which is the Low Carbon Development Strategy, which is their plan for the future in which they want to develop, like it'd be like Canada's plan for emissions reductions. This low carbon development strategy is kind of goes across sectors and is a plan for them to develop, but develop by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And a big part of that LCDS is having less emissions from the degradation of their forests. So they have something called MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is the system, the MRV system, which is what is used and executed on in Guyana for monitoring the forest. So using satellite remote sensing, going out in the field and doing statistics and so forth, and then reporting on that to then kind of report back to Norway and then whomever else they have to report to say, look, this is how much carbon we're saving by not deforesting. And it's also a great way forward for training people and providing them with capacity and giving them jobs. So jobs as a result from this kind of work as well. So this this kind of framework, RED, has been really contentious at first because you get into there's a lot of challenges associated with it, but it's starting to kind of demonstrate that it can really work in providing economic gains like livelihoods for people and inflows of cash into countries that need it, but then also the obvious benefits of not deforesting and then and maintaining ecosystem services, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then also maintaining biodiversity and nutrient cycling and all that kind of other stuff for the country. So what are some challenges? Pricing is a bit of a challenge. It seems that the pricing is not quite as expensive as it should be. So therefore, back to Megan's question, if we can't make the economics work for it, if it's still just a donor-driven process, it's still going to be based on the goodwill of these countries that are willing to kind of invest in this stuff and not so much on the market transaction value of that. The other part of it is social license. So when RED was first launched, there was a lot of pushback from it on different countries. And some countries like Brazil were highly opposed to that because they felt, I mean, some people felt it was an imposition on the sovereignty of the country, like a land grab. Other people rightly pointed out that it could interfere dramatically with the livelihoods of the people who live on that land. So, like we say, oh, we shouldn't cut down rainforests, right? Well, guess what? You know, there's a lot of indigenous people and so forth that live in rainforests that derive their livelihood by harvesting stuff from the rainforest. So there needs to be that kind of provision in place that we're not kind of fundamentally impacting the capability of people that live in the forest dwellers of like making a living. So therefore, that's a component of social license. Land tenure, big issue, right? So who owns the land? You know, if we're going to say this much carbon exists in this land, who is going to be the owner of that? Therefore, who gets the cash, right? And in some cases, some countries like the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and other ones, land tenure is still a very tenuous issue. You know, land tenure is a tenuous issue in Canada when you look at, say, treaties and so forth. So it's got that much kind of that many problems associated as well in a lot of different countries. And then capacity is the last component challenge, which is do we have the skills and capability of the people on the ground to actually do the work? And that's usually a problem that needs to be addressed when you're developing a project. Now, I have a personal experience with this. When I presented a RED project in the DRC in Japan in 2010, where the Pygmies arrived, or the representative Pygmies, and basically crashed the party by saying, look, you know, who's benefiting from this? These kind of extracting resources and this RED projects in our land, traditional land, and we are the Pygmies. And you know, they had a legitimate argument, and we hadn't, you know, gone to the step of kind of looking at the broader land tenure system and history of DRC because we were focused on our area, which was not Pygmy land. But there were broader issues there with the land rights of Pygmies, and they had been basically kind of pushed around for you know, who knows, like as long as development had occurred in that country. So that was, you know, my first experience with people like freaking out over that stuff, and it was a big deal actually at the time because my first presentation of that sort. So what will happen? Well, the demand is there, right? So the demand is there for those credits, for those offset credits. The demand is there for sustainable forest management. I say the political will is there. There's countries like Guyana have progressed on this. Vietnam has some good RED projects. Bolivia has a really good RED project. There's a lot of good RED projects out there that have been done, and they serve as kind of a good example. But there needs to be fortification on the regulations and the pricing side of things in order to really kind of advance that. And so, you know, does it work? Like, does it, from a payment from ecosystem service standpoint, does it really work? Yes, it is, but sometimes it can be confused as a license, a pure commodity deal, right? Because you're dealing with just carbon credits in that case. And in some cases, some people perceive it as a license to pollute, right? So you have some purchaser that's willing to kind of put the money into these projects, but that gives them a ticket to then emit greenhouse gas emissions from elsewhere in the world. So this is the whole thing about offsets that why, and I agree with that rationale. It can be a license to pollute. So that's one example of a payment for ecosystem service project or project. So I'm going to quickly, because I've taken me longer to explain than I thought. I'm going to talk about one other one because there's a lot of, this is why it's an interesting field. There's a lot of things emerging in this area and things that can be done is water, right? What's the other big one? Can you apply this to water? Do you think you can do payment for ecosystem services for water? What do you think? Yes or no? Yes? You think it'll work? It would be complicated. Why is it complicated? Why? Those are good points, but why? Yes, so many users. What else? For River, who gets the money? Yes. Cross jurisdictions? Yes. What else? Up for abuse? Yes. There's a lot of problems with it because, I mean, if I were to sum it up, it's harder to constrain, right? Water and water provision, happens over typically quite big areas. You can't just have like this one little water provision project going on in this like couple hectares. Like you could have an afforestation project or a avoided deforestation project over this little area of land here. Boom, and you can like measure it and do the stuff, and you're done. Water's different. It's a little more complicated because you're dealing with um, the watershed. Yeah, they're typically at the watershed scale of work. So that gets complicated because at the watershed scale, you have a bunch more stakeholders. You have a bunch more biophysical processes going on that are all working together. So yeah, it is a little more complicated, but it can work. So freshwater provision is incredibly important and therefore should be valued, especially in different regions. And there's a lot of work that's gone into this, and I'm not sure that we're there yet, but I think it's an area that's going to kind of increasingly be an area where you're going to see some neat stuff happen. So here's a good a paper, if you want to take a look at this one, that is focusing on, just one sec, bring that up in a new window. Oops. I don't know if that worked for you. Oh, just a sec. I did it twice, that's why. There we go. Just a sec here. I'm going to put this one through again. Here. Sorry about that. Bang. Try this. This one. It's a McGill paper. Good old McGill. Recasting payments for ecosystem services and water resource management, a novel institutional approach. So what you will notice about this, and why I think it's interesting to look at water and carbon, because A, they're ones that most people can really get right away, is that the execution on them is a lot different, right? Like how you go about valuing things is going to be a lot different between these two kind of phenomenon. So Michelle, would hinder awful orgs like Nestle having kind of value system in place? Well, this can work. I mean, this is where I think we can make some progress with companies like Nestle and other resource users by introducing this way of thinking. Now, I'm not going to say like, this is going to be the savior that's going to, stop commodification of these resources and so forth. But I'm all for finding ways that businesses can mainstream this kind of thinking into what they do. In 560, this is kind of what we're working on. All right. So this paper here is a really nice paper looking at how you go about kind of establishing values. And in this paper, unlike forest carbon, there's a lot of different kind of ways values intersect. Equity plays a role. People's perception. So like the sheer market-based approach, which kind of what I told you was for the RED project was really a market-based approach for doing that kind of valuation. Whereas waters is different. Like I think we have to be careful about purely market-based approaches for water because it's a little more complicated because it's such a shared resource. Okay, and most of the time you're dealing with a collective when you're dealing with these kind of water payment for ecosystem service projects. So this paper really does a nice job of looking at different ways of linking water resource management and kind of water conservation and ecosystem service conservation or sustainable management ecosystem services with integrated and adaptive approaches to water resource management. This is kind of making the link between those two things, which makes it quite exciting. Okay, so that's a paper that I would recommend if you're interested in this stuff. Have a look at it because it's a nice one. It's easy to read. But this is an area that requires some work. So I'm going to just put through some examples of where this has been done. So this next link here, so that paper looks at valuation, how we might go about doing the valuation, like TEEB does. And TEEB is a good example of how you can value it. But this is an example from Japan where they're looking at conserving water through upstream-downstream relationships. So this is where downstream organizations that benefited from fresh water use and so forth were willing to pay into a fund or a process for upstream management practices that would ensure that that water stays that way, stays being provided in a fresh way. You can see that there's some very challenging governance issues that need to be addressed when you're doing this, but it's been done. And this example from Japan, I think, is a good example of how you could go about doing that. Not surprising that it came from Japan, because Japanese tend to be quite progressive on this front. Okay, here's another one, which is from the UN Sustainable Finance, UNDP, UN Development Program Sustainable Finance. And this one here is a kind of examples of where payment for ecosystem services projects have been put in place. Okay, so if you go to that UNDP site, you'll see some actual examples. And what's interesting is they're quite a bit different, right? So they have why I brought this one up here. You have, I'm going to see if I've only got two here, but they've got, the one is in French, so if hopefully someone of you can read French. The one in French talks about water use. So it's in Central Africa, and how they've put in a payment for ecosystem service for sustainable water use and sustainable management of a riverine ecosystem. Okay, so in this case here, you can see the donors if you go to that website. This one here, again, this is donor driven. So similar to the one with Norway in the RED project, it's donors that have financed this, right? So it's not just purely a market transaction where there's someone saying, look, I'm going to get these water credits and I'm going to pay you this much per liter of water, and then boom, we're done. This is a little more kind of, it's in Gabon, and it's funded through from the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, and UNDP. PNUD is UNDP. And so there's 100,000, there's 859,000 US dollars from the GEF and about 100 grand from the UNDP. And that has then been put into that country to help with sustainable land management, sustainable ecosystem management, to ensure that those ecosystem services from that riverine system are intact. Okay, so it's a donor-driven process to promote the common good. So that's our sustained freshwater provision through this project. Okay. So it's not really a market transaction. So the steps for doing this for a payment for ecosystem service project are as follows. Okay, and these are coming from this website. I know I'm getting you a lot of links, but this is good information for you. This is from the UNDP Sustainable Development Finance project or program. Number one step, identify the ecosystem services. So if it's water provision or whatever, you identify what they are, and then the geographical boundaries. So it's the watershed, right, in this case. Secondly, identify the sellers, providers, and buyers, beneficiaries. So the sellers and buyers, or sellers, providers, could be those that have, the water rights, and then the beneficiaries who benefit from that could be, I don't know, those that are kind of wanting water credits. In this case, the buyers. Like, so in the case of that one I just showed you with the Gabon, you have sellers and providers are those that are living in that system, right? Those are the ones that are like the stewards of that land. They could be a community group, they could be the government, whatever. Those that are responsible for that. And the buyers and beneficiaries in that case are the donors, because buyers are those that are providing the money for those ecosystem services. So that's a unique situation, well, much like the Guyana one, because the buyers or beneficiaries are donors. Like, those are the ones who want to see sustainable development, like the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, or the Kingdom of Norway. But in other cases, it can be a purely market transaction. So who deal? I have a concern with the carbon forest management. This looks like a foreign investment. So will these investors claim ownership of these lands or some type of right? Beautiful question. Okay, this is where we're going to get into some of the tricky parts of this. And this is the problem that Brazil had with that, right? They had a problem with sovereignty. So what if, let's say, a big energy company from Canada wanted to go to be carbon neutral, said, okay, we're going to offset all of our emissions over the next 5 years by forest carbon, right? That's a legitimate idea. And they said, okay, we're going to invest in, I don't know, Peru, the Peruvian Amazon. And we're going to come and say, we want all the offset credits that are created from conserving this rainforest for the next 10 years, okay? And we're going to give you, I don't know, let's say 5 million, 10 million US dollars, maybe it's more, whatever the math works out, you know what I mean? Like whatever, how you do the math. So what happens though as a result of that? Who then owns that, the rights to that land? And to what degree will that interfere with the livelihoods of the people living on that land or the interests, the national interests? And this is where you get into some tricky situations where you get a foreign entity having the rights over, you know, sovereign land. And that's actually one of the big problems right out of the gates with REDD was the fact that livelihoods could be impacted. And then how do you negotiate that in terms of the ownership of that? And that has to be worked out in the deal, actually. So much like it would be much like energy rights, like do you have or forestry rights? It's actually very similar because in a timber situation, you would have like in Canada, you would have the right to a license to harvest timber over a certain period of time. Whereas in this case, that would have to be worked out in the deal. You'd have a certain amount of time where you have access to those credits that are produced from those ecosystems, and that then would have certain provisions associated with it. And the provisions would be that that land couldn't be deforested. That'd be one thing, and then also there may be some impacts on the land use in that area as well. But those have to be worked out in the deal. Like I could send you the information on the Guyana situation, and then there's also been some proposed projects that haven't worked out because of that, like because the local population said, heck no, we don't want that kind of intrusion in our land, right? So there's the potential for that. There's the potential for it to have negative effects on the local land, like smallholders that typically have been living there for years, indigenous people, and then here we come, this big offset deal that then says now you can no longer harvest bushmeat from this land. This is the Congo example. Because of this new UN REDD project we have in place, you local populations can no longer like harvest mangoes or whatever, and those can turn out to be like highly deleterious provisions in that deal, right? So there's a big social component that needs to be scrutinized these projects. That's a great question, and that's one of the things that really has impact. There's another. I'm going to get to a couple other big problems. So yeah, the first step, geographic boundaries and ecosystem services. Second, and sellers. So the sellers and then the beneficiaries. 3, definition of the market and of the price, right? So how do we define that price? In some cases, it's through a regulated market, like I was saying. In some cases, it's an over-the-counter deal. The price is made up by like whoever wants to buy it. And it could be highly subjective, but you have to have an idea of that, what the market signal is and the pricing you're dealing with. Fourthly, 5 steps. The fourth one, determination of the governance and institutional and legal arrangements. So this, Julio, comes to your question. How do you govern that deal? Like, what are the institutional arrangements with the country, with the buyer, with the local population? If there's no land tenure system in place, it gets even more complicated because you don't know who owns the land, right? So that becomes really tricky in places where you don't have land tenure. And then 5th is the collection of the biophysical data and the baseline data for the monitoring. So in Guyana, they've got a tremendous MRV program in place, and it's really helped to advance them in terms of their capacity for monitoring that stuff. Because you need to monitor this. This is a cost of doing these projects. When you're doing one, you have to put in the cost of monitoring. Okay, that has to be in place. So all of those things need to be in place to do a REDD project. How do you monitor? What is the boundaries of it? Who are the players? Who's the buyer, the seller? What's the market dynamics? Or if there are any, maybe there aren't. And then what are some of the governance issues and legal arrangements, the contracts and so forth? Okay. I'm just going to jump to one other issue because it relates to Julio's question is, okay, so if we go back to red, the idea is to avoid deforestation, right? That's the objective. Avoid deforestation and reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with it. Earlier on, I mentioned how much carbon is stored in the forest. What could happen as a result of that? What if you had a big red project in this part of the country? Bang, you put it in place. What could happen once that goes into place? That would be deleterious. What could be a negative consequence? No. No. Think of the geography of it. This part over here, good, red. We've got a deal in place. Money's flowing in for conservation. Yes, water's tricky. Well, in fact, water's trickier because you have cross-border issues, and it's harder to quantify water. It's harder to like monitor that. What's to stop a group to going next door to the red project? You have this big park that is designated a red project. There's financing in place from Norway. Great, awesome. But guess what? You know, I don't know. Well, let's just go. Let's just move over. Where's the boundary? It's over there. It's 5 kilometers over there. Let's go 5 kilometers. And what do we do when we get to the edge where the monitoring ends and the boundary of that project is? What do we do? We're the developers. We're the cattle ranchers. We're the whomever who wants to make some cash. There's no land tenure system in place. What do we do when we get to the of that project? Cut it down. Exactly. Cut it down. So there's this leakage effect where you have conservation here, but guess what? The development just goes elsewhere. So that's a concern. It's a known concern. Okay? So there's a lot of problems associated with these things. It's not as easy as at first when I first learned about it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so brilliant, it's so easy and so clear. Not so. A lot of different problems. So this UNESCO, I think it's UNESCO, website is another good one. I'm going to wrap up here quickly because I know we're running over time, but we're on a roll here with this stuff, and I think you guys could benefit from it. This is a great reference here. I just found this one. Water ecosystem services. So back to Julio, it's like, how do you deal with this stuff? Well, we need some good reference material. So this publication is from UNESCO, but it's a critical examination of, and it's free. You can download this, of water ecosystem service projects, and they give you some good examples. It's about 200 pages in length. This document. So there's a lot to it. So a lot of these nuances, and you can see here in the timeline if you just go to that and look at page 16, you can see that in the 1960s there wasn't stuff. They track the history of ecosystem service stuff, right? 97, you had Costanza's paper coming out, and you know, even in the 1970s you had some ecosystem services with economic stuff happening, but not a lot. But then as you get into like the 2000s up to this is 2013, you have projects, you have global assessments, the MA, and so forth that really kind of help to build the assessment for that. So we're in like way past this in 2020. The time is now for this kind of work. This is why it's an exciting time for you to be studying this stuff, because this is like, it's just becoming so mainstream now, and we need to figure out how to really do this in a more efficient way. So this guide, I think, is a really good source of reference for things, those water resource questions, because you got to look at examples. That's the best thing to look at, is these projects or these research papers that were done, and this is what worked and this is what didn't work for them. This is how I've learned about this stuff, just either doing it personally or knowing of projects that have been done. Couple last links here. Evaluation. Okay, so I put through that. So that's the UNESCO one. Here's a good paper here on, and you should be able to access through the UN library. This is one from Nepal. So this is a good example of ecosystem service indicators and stakeholders' willingness to pay for select ecosystem services. That's another thing. How do you it? So one of the 5 principles is establishing a market price for it. So you can say, well, the market says it's this, but then another way to do it is when you're doing a project in a region is what are people's willingness to pay for it? Like in that Japan example, the downstream company would establish the willingness to pay for fresh water from upstream conservation. So there's willingness to pay as a methodology, and in 560 we'll look at this, of establishing a price for something, right, of the ecosystem service. So that's a good example and a good article. And then, so I want to kind of conclude by looking at this in the highly practical world of business, is how do you then actually operationalize this? So TEEP for business, and you'll look at this, I think hopefully all of you will, is one way of doing it. It's like, okay, this is a framework for doing it. But another one that came out in the late 2010s, or in 2009, 2009 and 8, 9, 10, is something from the WBCSD. Do you know these guys, WBCSD? World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Has anybody heard of them before? Okay. I think some of you will. Damona, you have. Others might have. If you don't, you should know about them. So here's they're a .org, so they're not a company. They're an organization, kind of like, I don't know, like the David Suzuki Foundation in a way. I guess they're an NGO by definition. Okay, I'm just gonna first, that's their website, check them out. And then this is a publication that, another one that when I started to look at the business side of this, applying it and pitching it. In fact, I even pitched this to TransCanada Pipelines, believe it or not, a while ago. It didn't work out too well. I wish it had, but didn't. Is how do you put this into some sort of operational framework for a business? And one way to do it is through this, which is WBCSD's corporate ecosystem valuation. It's a methodology for evaluating the use of ecosystems that corporations have. So back to, and this is a good way to conclude, is back to the question about those awful companies like Nestle, right? Awful companies. I actually had a guy, Nestle was on a panel that I moderated at the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week in January. Nestle was on the panel for their water stuff that they're doing, the water conservation projects and so forth. So I have sat next to like the bad guys and moderated them as they showed what they're doing in Oman and places like this. But for a company to have a methodology they can use, this is a good one. So WBSD has come up with this corporate ecosystem valuation, and this is a methodology for assessing the ecosystem services that a company uses in conducting their affairs. So Nestle could use this. One that I will give you as an example that has used this is Holcim. Has anybody heard of this company, Holcim? So Holcim, yeah, so Holcim is a Swiss, I think they're Swiss, aggregate company, cement. And they partnered up. They had a really progressive guy doing their environmental stuff, Paul Holthus. I forget for his name. He's since moved to the IUCN. So they came up with a way of looking at the ecosystem impacts of their quarry operations. Because if you think about aggregate, they pull a lot of stuff out of the earth when you're making cement. That has an ecosystem impact and the impact on ecosystem services. So they worked with WBCSD as well as the IUCN to develop this corporate ecosystem valuation, like a systems approach to quantifying the impacts of a company on systems. And therefore, from there, then you can get into PES if you wanted to, by looking at, okay, well, we're having this kind of impact on, I don't know, nutrient cycling or what have you. And once you've quantified that, you can look at, well, if we want to compensate for that, we should pay back to the community this amount of dollars, right, or whatever. You could use a variety of different valuation schemes for doing that. But this framework is pretty solid. I mean, it's a bit dated now, but it worked quite well, and they did some good demonstration projects. Holcim, a real company, in which they showcased how they could do that. And this leads into then what we're going to be looking at now in 560 with an environmental profit and loss account. Like you need to do an EPL, you need to have an understanding of what your ecosystem impacts are biophysically, and then you can put cost to it. And this corporate ecosystem valuation is one way of doing that. Okay, so the question is, does it work? Do you think PES works? I'm going to end with this. You've listened to me blab for a while. Do you think it works? PES, yes or no? Sarah is convinced. I've convinced you it works. Anybody else? Jeff thinks so. Anybody else? It's interesting. Yes, it is interesting. One more person. Anybody else think it can work? In theory, it seems complex to practice. Yes. Yeah, so I guess this is, yes, difficult to do. This is my answer. It can work. Julio doesn't think so. It's okay, Julio. It's good to be skeptical about these things. I'm skeptical about these things. Mona, it's costly. Yes, it's expensive to do this. I can say with confidence that it can work and it can also not work. It really depends on these two main things. Well, I guess three things, but three main things. Number one, where are you doing it? What is the jurisdiction you're doing it? Do you have strong enough institutions in place? If you don't have strong institutions in place, I don't think it will work. Strong governments, strong organizations, either NGOs and so forth, that are the stakeholders that are associated with this. I like to see a pluralistic approach to doing stuff like this. So rather than just having a buyer, like a corporate buyer, and then maybe a government or something, or not even a government, I like to see a diversity of organizations that are involved, each of whom has a different objective, right, or mandate. So for instance, a government, either national or both, national and local government on the government side. I like to see an NGO involved to perhaps help with the monitoring. So WBCSD had a company, they had NGOs, WBCSD, as well as the IUCN to help with the science, which is IUCN.org, an NGO. And then they had good relationship with the government. In the case of Guyana, you have municipalities could be reluctant. Yeah, I'm sure they could be, and they are in certain areas I've worked in. Too much corruption in some countries. That's the other thing. You got to be careful. That's why I'm saying the institutions have to be in place, and you have to have, like I would say, in the institution side, you have to have land tenure, understood land tenure. Condition of the terms could be for what are you offsetting? Yeah, that could be the case. So it's part of the deal. So at institutions, that's one thing that needs to be in place. Gosh, I think there's three things. I think it depends on whether there's strong institutions. I think it depends if there are what ecosystem services we're dealing with, right? So I think it works better for some than others. For climate regulation and carbon, it actually works pretty well, because you can constrain those things. Like we've already seen how complicated water ecosystem services can get. And that's kind of a measurable thing as well because of the scale of it. That's a bit of a problem. What if you looked at, say, tourism, right? So as opposed to for the aesthetic quality, say for coral reefs, right? If we're going to do payment for ecosystem services of tourism in, say, Belize, how does that get structured, right? So you got to look at the pricing of that. The value that's created for tourism as a result of conservation exercises or activities in like parks in Belize, and as well as for provisioning services in coastal. Like that's my experience is mostly in that area. Eco fee similar, yeah, that's one thing. Like an eco fee, that's one way to finance it. Like I pay, you pay to go in the diving parks in Belize, and I'm happy to pay. here you go, take the money. Because I know that that money then goes into a kitty, like a fund that's going to help with paying for all the monitoring and so forth. But if there's not strong institutions, like Julio was pointing out, then who's to say where that money's going to go, right? And who's to say who gets hired? Is it local Belizeans for doing the monitoring, or is, I don't know, I don't know. Like there's got to be some social considerations. You have to have strong institutions. So we've got, I would say, yes, first, strong institutions. It would depend on that. Secondly, depends on what ecosystem services and how much work has been done on them, and whether or not you have good guidelines in place, and whether by nature they're easy to quantify and examine. And then third, I think it depends on the economics. Will the economics properly work, right? Either if it's a market-based transaction or if it's a donor-based project, will the economics really work? And part of that to me, and I've done projects like this, are the deals good? You have to have good deals. People need to have good deals in place. I sound like Donald Trump saying we need good deals, but you do need good deals for this kind of stuff. You have like this one group is the winner and these rest are the losers. You have to have good deals for groups. People need to benefit. Okay, Alberta has been championing the market-based trade in Alberta. Yeah, I know some people have been doing that stuff in the market pricing. A Royal Roads person did her PhD on that. Michelle here in Tofino, Taloquiet Nation are proposing an eco fee through tourism to manage the climate. Absolutely, great idea. I'd have zero problem with that. In fact, it should be high, right? That money then is put into some sort of kind of trust or escrow that can be used for financing. The other costly, Mona, it's expensive. Monitoring is expensive. It takes time. You need to get the data. You need to people trained to do it, to go gather the data. You need to buy data sometimes. It's a costly exercise. Trust me, projects are expensive to put in place with foreign observers and monitors. That's one way to do it. You need transparency and that kind of thing. Like, trust me, when Norway goes to put 250 million US dollars into Guyana, it's not like they don't hand over a check and say, okay, cool, see you later. Like it doesn't work like that. There's a lot of oversight that goes into that. There's a lot of documentation that goes along with that. Verification, the monitoring and verification needs to be verified and audited. So you need that in place as well. So, I mean, we're at an hour and a half, and you're still sticking around. So I don't know, either it's bored Tuesday night or you actually like this stuff. But I've talked a lot. It's kind of one of the longer ones. So this is a story. I mean, this stuff can work. I think it's why I'm really interested in this and work on this is because I believe that it's a necessary thing. I think we need to make the economic work on this because people need livelihoods. As we've seen with the pandemic, once we shut down economies, what happens? People break things apart. Society breaks down. We cannot not have economic activity. And PES is one thing that I think could be an interesting part of that. So Almona shared some PDF. Good. So this is happening in Canada, in Alberta. There are RED projects or forestry projects that have been done in BC. I don't think we've done RED projects, but there's been afforestation projects and reforestation projects. So it's not like it hasn't been done in Canada, and it can work elsewhere. But there is, it is kind of a different paradigm. You're pricing stuff people aren't used to seeing priced. So that is always a tricky thing to do. But accounting is catching up, right? Those in 560, you've seen that in the literature, the standards that have been created. I've shared with you tonight examples of projects that have been done and ways it's been done. And also kind of some of the challenges with that. So I'm confident. I'm not 100% sold, and I think it's getting better. I've seen this, first time I saw it, PES was, I guess, in 2006, around there in the literature, 5. And then projects, which were kind of some of which I was like, I don't know. And hokey at first, like, they had just, at first I felt it was just, people trying to promote conservation in a different way, which is nothing wrong with that, but that won't work for businesses usually. Has to be kind of transactional. and there has to be some kind of, a little more rigor associated with the projects. And I'm seeing that with some of the projects, okay? Some of the things that are happening. So there we go. That's the podcast for tonight, a lengthy one. Yeah. So I think this is a component of the green economy, potentially circular economy. Imagine putting this into an LCA, where you're looking at the life cycle assessment of a product that draws on certain ecosystem services, and then you put money to that for costing. It's exciting. I think it could happen, and I'm seeing it happen. It's happening in different ways. All right. So, any other questions? I need to go consume some ecosystem services, some food. I haven't had dinner. All right. And for 560, we're going to look in more detail into this stuff, in the numbers and nuance, some of the issues that come up. Mike Cooley was pointing out. All right. Well, thank you for coming out and for your attention. That was a marathon, but it's all good stuff. This is the real stuff.